Good evening, everybody. Thank you and welcome for coming. Thank you for showing up. This is amazing to have all these folks here show up. Maurice, thank you for agreeing to do this. This is amazing. Uh, First of all, I want to just say that I had the pleasure of reading Maurice's book, Let God Sort Him. Amazing, amazing. We had a conversation the other day, Maurice and I told him that my reason for getting involved in higher education was to become a great writer. And it hasn't happened yet. But to be able to write great, excuse me, it hasn't happened yet. I'm still working on it, but this is the way I want to write. Guys, if you haven't read this, please read this. It's amazing. It's incredible. So I just want to introduce Maurice Chammah. And Maurice, please just tell us a little bit about your work and how you got to do the work you do and why you do the work you do. Just introduce yourself a little bit, please.
Sure, of course. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Musicambia is also near and dear to my heart because Elliot Cole, your program director, was a childhood friend of mine in Austin, Texas, where I am speaking to you from now. I am a staff writer for the Marshall Project, which is a small nonprofit that covers criminal justice issues. And for the last sort of 5 to 10 years, depending on how I tell the story, I've been working on this book about the death penalty, which is a subject that came to sort of obsess me over the course of the years. And it was the first way that I sort of got into the criminal justice system as a journalist. And it was largely through work at yet another nonprofit where I was basically helping to collect oral histories of people who were in some way touched by the punishment. Through that work, I sort of spent hours and hours interviewing family members of people on death row, family members of people who had been executed, also family members of people who had been murdered, sort of on the other side of these cases, as well as prosecutors and defense lawyers. And I came through that work to see that the death penalty plays a kind of role in our larger criminal justice system that is much larger than it may seem on the surface. So the number of people who are sentenced to death in any given year is very small. The number of executions is very small. And now there's roughly 20 a year in the whole country. That compare that, of course, to the fact that there's more than 2 million people in prisons. But what I've come to see is that the death penalty is sort of the most intensely punitive thing we as a society do. It's kind of a symbol, a way that we as a society say that some people are irredeemable and that punishment is the goal of our criminal justice system. And that sense of punitiveness sort of trickles down through the rest of the system. So as I got deeper into reporting on other aspects of, prison conditions, jail conditions, the way that, police go about their work, I realized that the death penalty played this kind of important symbolic role at the top of the system, kind of trickling down and making the punitiveness and the sense of punishment in the rest of the system sort of easier for people to swallow. So, for example, if the death penalty is on the table, if it's a part of your society, then sending somebody to prison for 40 years or 50 years seems more lenient by comparison. Whereas, by contrast, in Germany or in Norway or in some other Western European countries, no prison sentence is longer than 20 years. So sending somebody to 20 years in that situation seems like the most punitive and excessive thing you can do. So the death penalty kind of shaped and contorted our entire system at about the same time that we as a society, and I'm speaking now sort of about the last 30 to 40 years, took this really big turn towards punishment as kind of the goal of our system. I think now we're sort of in a moment of criminal justice reform. That's the phrase that often gets used. And as we sort of enter that stage, you see a lot of debates in Congress, on CNN about how we reform the criminal justice system, how we improve relations between police and communities, how we shrink the prison system from its incredible growth. And I wrote this book in part to try to contribute to this conversation, to try to sort of pull out this one piece of the criminal justice system that I thought was especially important and symbolic, and kind of show how the story of the death penalty can teach us larger things about, the importance of mercy, the importance of thinking in new and more innovative ways about how we respond to crime. And that's what I was hoping to do with the book. And so, that's sort of where we're at.
The part that I love the most, I think, about the book is that you didn't just speak about so everyone who's been impacted by this institution, right, the death penalty institution, whether it's the correctional officers, the lawyers, the judges, the prosecutors. You told all their stories in a way that and I hate to use this word to humanize, because we're all human. I don't think anyone needs to be humanized. I think we need to stop dehumanizing folks. But I sort of love the way that you humanized everyone, because very often it's very easy when you're on one side of the divide to make someone else the enemy, right? If I'm the one on death row, I see the prosecutor as the enemy, and so on and so forth. And I love how you made everyone not the enemy, everyone human, and everyone seemed. It was incredible. I think you did an incredible job.
Thank you. I want to say off that, yeah, it's very easy to see people as the enemy. And I think one thing I realized as I did the research and kind of explored moments in time that were pretty far from my own experience. You know, I was interviewing people about death penalty trials that took place in Houston in the 1980s or in Dallas in the 1970s. And I was not around for these things. But I realized that, you know, when somebody commits a crime, when somebody, especially in a case of murder, where someone has died, right, it's a tragedy. And it is very human, I think, to respond to that tragedy with rage, with anger, with a sense that the world has been wronged in some way, and we need, as a society, to do something to right that wrong. And I think a lot of prosecutors, a lot of police see, or at least when they start their careers, that this is what they're doing, and that they can sort of right those wrongs by, you know, finding the person who committed this terrible crime, who created this tragedy, and putting them in prison forever, or even, you know, in some cases, giving them the death penalty. And so when I was reading trial transcripts from these cases, you would see prosecutors refer to people as evil, as irredeemable, right, as monsters. And it was only over the course of sort of a kind of a 10, 20 years that defense lawyers, sometimes using art, sometimes using stories from people's lives, sort of realized that they could sort of push back against this dehumanization by kind of giving members of juries, giving the public ways to kind of view the people who committed a crime with a little bit more mercy, right? And often, you know, I would interview lawyers, and they would be so eager to share with me the art that their clients had made. There was one particular anecdote that's really stuck with me, where, you know, I was interviewing this lawyer about a man who had been executed. She was his lawyer back in the early 1990s. And she, you know, wanted to talk about the case and the legal issues, but she really wanted to show me these like little figures he'd made. He'd made little houses and little clocks out of pieces of wood that he was allowed to use in the prison. And she just felt like this was what told this man's story, this art that he had created, as much as the stories of his childhood and the stories of of his addiction that led to this crime, et cetera. So, you know, as I was doing the research, I was constantly seeing all these moments where people were sort of drawn towards humanity and drawn towards mercy through the arts.
I just wanted to read a quote. It's from, you quoted an attorney, the attorney Owen, I believe the last name was.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote says, "Only a glance at the stacks upon stacks of caged and condemned men within the walls is needed to know surely, viscerally, that capital punishment is genocide." And that, man, that blew me. Every time I read it, it makes my hair stand up. So is it okay? Should we be okay in this country, or any country, with some type of genocide if we accept that premise that the death penalty is genocide? Should we be okay with it if it means keeping the public safe?
Well, that lawyer, so that quote was actually from a lawyer named Dana Lynn Reeser. And part of why I focused on her in the book so much is because she saw the links between our contemporary criminal justice system and slavery on the one hand, and also the sort of horrific history of lynchings in the early 20th century. In her mind, lynchings, and by which I mean, you know, kind of murders of primarily Black men on the courthouse squares of small towns around the country. This is something that was just part of American life in the early 20th century. It dissipated in the 40s and 50s and sort of disappeared. But to this lawyer, to Dana Lynn, it had just sort of gone underground and become part of the system itself, right? That society didn't want to kill people in public anymore and had moved towards this other model where they do it behind closed doors. I think that's why she saw use the word genocide in her description of that. But again, I think that I wanted to tell her story in the book because I found it very inspiring the way that she refused to make anyone into a monster. And I should say, of course, her own clients, the people who were facing the death penalty, she wanted people to see that they were not monsters. But there were times where, in an interview with her, I would say, this prosecutor, like, I mean, what's wrong with him? Is he just evil or what? I would ask the question sort of flippantly like that. And she would say, well, no. He's just responding to what's around him. He's taking the influences that are around him. And she refused at every turn to see even the people on the other side of the cases, the prosecutors, the police unions, the people who were sort of fighting her in public as monsters. She sort of refused to write them off. And that sort of taught me as a journalist, I think, a lot about the world. And it then ended up influencing the book, where at every turn I was trying to look for reasons why people do things that I may not agree with, and that and to at every turn say, well, it's too easy to say that this person is just evil, right? Or that they're just a monster, or they're a politician who's just looking for votes. That's too easy. I want to try to understand what's the world around them that created that person. What are the incentives that they're responding to? Just that we know, in the same way that we know that when somebody commits a robbery or a murder or sells drugs, right, that they're not doing that in a vacuum. They didn't just like wake up one day and say, oh, I'm gonna do this really terrible thing, this thing that sort of in some way hurts society. We grow up with all sorts of influences, and this is not to excuse personal responsibility, but every person is a sort of complicated mixture of their individual decisions and the inputs, the ways that they've been shaped into the person that they become.
Yes, I love that, and you did a fantastic job sort of showing that it's very easy to collapse someone's entire being into that one thing, right? That worst possible thing they've ever done, or even the best possible thing they've ever done. And people are so much more complicated than that. We're more, with fathers, with brothers, with sisters, with cousins, we're musicians, we're artists, and it's very easy to sort of collapse someone's being into that one thing, especially when it's a violent crime. So sort of bringing it all together. What does any of this, right? What does the book? What is your work? What does it have to do with Musicambia? How does that connect? How does that connection even happen?
Sure, I was thinking about that a lot. At the Marshall Project where I work, we're primarily an outlet that covers we cover the criminal justice system, but our approach is generally investigative journalism, and that phrase generally is about bad things that have happened, right, in the criminal justice system. People who have been sentenced to life in prison, even though they may be innocent, or even though they don't deserve that for what they did, or people who aren't getting access to good representation, or who are stuck in jail for very minor nonviolent crime simply because they are unable to pay bail, right? So we do investigative journalism about all these problems, but after working there for a few years, it all started to feel sort of hopeless to me. There was a sense that, well, we could just keep writing these stories about these problems over and over again, and there's not a lot of reasons for hope. And around that time, a few years ago, I decided just for myself that I would make an active effort to try to write more stories that had a little more hope in them. And one of the ways I went about it was stories about artists. I wrote a piece about Mark Lofney, whose art is being auctioned off tonight. He had done a series in which he asked men in his prison in Pennsylvania to sit for portraits, and he ended up producing more than 500 portraits, which went on to be shown at MoMA PS1 in New York City. I did other sort of short profiles of visual artists. I hope to do more profiles of musicians. And when I set about writing this book, I had it in my head that the arts had to be sort of a piece of it. And so, I profile one man who was on death row for many years, and he had written poetry, and I include some of that poetry in the book. And all of this is not to suggest oh, what a great person he is. He really doesn't deserve this punishment because he's angelic in some way. It's more to say he is a human who reckons with what he has done, and in this case, the fact that he actually killed somebody, and in circumstances that really he cannot defend, and that he lives with that for the rest of his life. But also, he is capable of turning that tragedy, that lived experience, into art. The goal is to kind of, the arts are a way of sort of showing people that we kind of contain everything as humans, right? That we contain the capability to do really terrible things and to do really good things. And on our better days, we do one, and on our worst days, we do the other. And it's sort of up to society to kind of nudge us in a direction. So I see Musicambia as one of the ways in which we can, for people who are actually incarcerated, sort of nudge them towards better versions of themselves, to see their future with some sense of hope, to see that they can, that they don't just have to be, the man in the orange jumpsuit that the state has said is a monster, that they are capable of being creative, expressive human beings. And then on the flip side, we always talk about humanizing people in prison for the public. And again, I don't want that to sound simplistic, because it's actually a very complicated thing. And I do think that just over and over again, the more that people, turn on the Today Show and see Kenyatta and Joyce DiDonato, doing music together, the more that they see that people in prisons are capable of things other than crime, right? That they are rich, full human beings, and music is a really sort of illustrative way of showing that to people. I think that this does play a really key role in the larger effort to kind of shift society away from seeing punishment as the only way to respond to crime. Because if you see that people who are incarcerated are capable of creativity, you also can imagine a world in which the response to a crime is not just throw this person away, it's rehabilitation. And the seeds of this are in our society. I often tell people, that many prison systems are technically called the Department of Corrections, and it's ironic and a little ridiculous because they're not really correcting anything. But the fact that that is in the name is a sign that there was a hope at one time that they would correct something, that they would sort of steer people towards rehabilitation. So I see Musicambia basically as part and parcel of this effort to kind of educate the public and push us away from purely thinking of people in prisons as someone who did something wrong and needs to be punished, and more as sort of bastions of potential, right? People who are someday going to rejoin our communities and have a lot to contribute, and they may be contributing music, or they may be contributing in a kind of literal economic way as workers in our economy. There's a million versions of this, but Musicambia is sort of one of the key institutions out there that's really sort of trying to kind of push the window of what is possible in people's minds, and show people that that people who are incarcerated are more than the worst things they've ever done.
Amen. And as an alumnus of the program, I can attest to that. I was involved in the program inside, as was Kenyatta and Robbie and Lumba, and amazing, man. Just with Jesse and Nathan and the rest of the crew, Elliot, Jan, whatever what the whole crew does, and how much passion, sincerity, and love and they bring into that place is amazing. It's incredible, and it does wonders for the men inside and for the women. But I wasn't in the facility, obviously, but you're right. It brings so much hope and possibilities, and like you said, I know it helped for me. It helped put me in contact with a better version of myself. And it's an amazing thing to know that that exists somewhere, that there is a better version of me, that I don't have to accept the narrative that's been given to me or that I've sort of created for myself, that I can, there's so much possibilities. It's incredible. And so I can attest to that. That's amazing. If there's one thing, and you've probably answered this already, but just if there's one thing that you wanted folks to take away from your book, from your writing, what would that one thing be?
I think the big takeaway that I hope people get from it is that they should take ownership of the system that we have. In the book, I tell lots and lots of stories about people kind of deferring responsibility. Prosecutors who say, well, I didn't give him the death penalty, the jury did that. Or the jury saying, well, we gave him the death penalty, but he's going to get appeals. Or every judge saying, well, he's already been through a trial and other judges are going to look at this and the governor's going to look at it. There's all this sort of deferring of responsibility. But the point of the book is to show that we all need to sort of stop doing that and take ownership of the criminal justice system that we have as voters, as citizens, as people who have some control. And if we don't like it, we actually do have power over it. One of the sort of sad qualities of the history of the death penalty in the United States is that we have it because we're a democracy. We are not China, we are not Iran, we are not these countries that sort of sentence people to death or long terms of incarceration from on high without checks and balances. We voted in legislators who made sentences longer, and we voted in prosecutors who sought the death penalty, and we can now vote in legislators and prosecutors who do something different if we just develop the political will to do it. Again, my hope is that the book can kind of contribute to the sort of humanization of people that will lead to results like that. It doesn't purport to advocate for a particular outcome. I don't really see that as my role as a journalist. But I want to sort of give people the tools to take ownership of the system and understand how we got here so that we can go somewhere different.
Would you consider yourself an abolitionist?
In the long-term sense, yeah. In the long-term sense that a world without crime is a world we all want to live in, and a world without prisons would respond to a world without crime. And sort of it's all of our responsibility to work towards a public safety system, a justice system that actually kind of ensures justice by making it so that we don't need prisons because we don't, have a world in which people are violating the social contract. And that may seem rosy-eyed, but, I had an editor, Bill Keller, he was the first editor of the Marshall Project, and his phrase for abolitionism was, well, what's a heaven for, right? If not, you need to have a sort of dream and end goal that you're working towards that kind of motivates this work that you're doing, exposing problems in the system, and as Musicambia does, going in and promoting the arts in prisons. You need to know what the 100-year out or 50-year out or 20-year out view of what you're doing is, so that you can make the best decisions about how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know personally, as does Gideon and Robbie, that people who are involved in the like programs like Musicambia, wherever they're at. I was in Sing Sing. The incidences of violence has decreased exponentially. I mean, unbelievably. And the people who are enrolled in the program also get involved in other programs such as colleges, vocational programs. So it does something. This creative spark does something to folks, and like you said, it puts us in contact with our better selves, and it makes us want to create, makes us want to better ourselves in every possible way. So the programs are extremely important. The work is extremely important. I think your work is extremely important. If there's anything else you want us to know, please tell us now. Is there another book?
Maybe in the future. Yeah, at this point, I don't have immediate plans to write another, just because it was such an exhausting and taxing experience. But I'm sort of thinking about it, and I think a big part of it is trying to think like a long term. How do we look towards the future of what the criminal justice system can be? I guess one other just thing I want to say that really surprised me from the research is, I imagine many of you know who Brian Stevenson is, the author of the book Just Mercy, who is now this kind of clarion moral voice of trying to rethink the criminal justice system. He's a lawyer who advocates for shorter sentences and against the death penalty. And, he's a New York Times bestseller now. Many Americans know his name. He's widely sort of seen as a kind of, I don't know if this is overstating it, but a kind of MLK of our time, this sort of moral voice who's trying to push us towards the future. But in the book research, I interviewed many people who were his colleagues in the early 90s, who came of age at the same time that he did, who started their careers as lawyers at the same time that he did. And they described just how unpopular what they did was. The fact that, so I write in the book about an organization of anti-death penalty lawyers who call themselves the Texas Resource Center. And part of why they call it something so vague, right? Texas Resource Center, that doesn't tell you what they do, is because if they didn't, they would get bomb threats, they would get hate mail, they would get graffiti on their building. People really, really hated what defense lawyers were doing back then. And The ones who still stuck with it and still said, no, we're still going to try to humanize these guys who are on death row and try to stop them from being executed. They had to suffer through a lot of unpopularity in order to do that. Fast forward to today, and we think of some of these people as heroes, right? Bryan Stevenson, as I said, is a New York Times bestseller. And I think that I found a lot in that kind of sweep of history to inspire me to think that there's people today who are kind of playing that Bryan Stevenson role, and Musicambia, I think, is one of them, who are doing work that is difficult, that is in some cases unpopular, with an eye towards a better future and sort of the hope that history will prove them right. So kudos to you all for that.
Okay, guys, our time is up. It flew by so fast. I thought we had more time. Maurice Chammah, thank you so much. I appreciate you. I appreciate the work you do. Thank you
so much
to do this. This is amazing. We got to chop it up some more. I would love to sit down and chat with you some more. Even have you down at the job and just talk.
I'd love that. I'd love that.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you everyone for listening in.